If you want to move, let's say, $1 billion from a bank in New York to a bank in London today, honestly, loading physical pallets of $100 bills onto a Boeing 747
Hmm.
and just flying it across the Atlantic is, well, it's often functionally faster than sending it through the traditional digital banking system.
Yeah, which is pretty crazy to think about.
Right. I mean, you would think, considering we live in this era of fiber optic cables and, algorithmic high-frequency trading, that moving institutional digital money would be as easy as sending an encrypted text message.
You definitely think so. But the reality of global finance is just completely bogged down by this archaic architecture. It's full of invisible checkpoints, correspondent banks, and delayed settlements that can literally take days to clear.
Yeah, and tearing down that patchwork is exactly what our mission is for you today. Because, you're joining this deep dive because you track the evolution of global financial infrastructure, and you want to see precisely where the plumbing of institutional money is actually heading next.
Exactly. And the friction right now is massive. We tend to assume that just because money appears on a screen, it's instantaneously mobile. But when you are dealing with sovereign national wealth, the digital environment we've built over the last, say, 50 years is heavily fragmented.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we are pulling the blueprint for this transition from a highly concentrated piece of architectural research. It's titled Architecting Interoperable Institutional CBDC Infrastructure Networks. And it's basically this granular look at how the biggest players on Earth plan to rewire the entire system.
It's such a critical roadmap, honestly, because the entire global financial system is currently locked in this weird transitional phase,
Yeah.
right? They're trying to figure out how to upgrade legacy national currencies into these highly efficient digital assets.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core premise we are dealing with here is a fundamental, almost philosophical contradiction in financial engineering. I mean, how do you take heavily regulated, rigidly controlled national money and force it to move at the incredibly fast, borderless speed of decentralized tech?
Yeah, that tension between control and velocity is really the defining engineering challenge of modern finance right now.
Right.
And before we examine the specific technological solutions proposed in this blueprint, we kind of have to look mechanically at why the current upgrades just aren't working.
So where does this architecture actually start?
Well, it starts by targeting the quote-unquote siloed nature of sovereign digital currencies. Now, most central banks are already rolling out or at least piloting digital versions of their fiat, but the blueprint points out a really severe architectural flaw.
Which is what exactly?
These new sovereign assets are incredibly rigid. They are built on bespoke, completely isolated ledgers.
Right. So a nation upgrades its financial stack. They issue a shiny new sovereign digital currency, but they build it entirely inward facing, like it only works for them.
Precisely. They create a closed loop. I mean, just because Nation A and Nation B both digitize their currencies, it definitely doesn't mean their respective ledgers can actually communicate with each other.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, they might use entirely different consensus mechanisms or, different cryptographic standards or different data privacy protocols. The asset is just entirely trapped within its own domestic tech environment.
It's kind of like it's like two neighboring countries deciding to upgrade their transportation infrastructure by building these state-of-the-art 300-mile-an-hour bullet trains. It's a total marvel of engineering.
Right, a huge upgrade.
But they build them on entirely different track gauges using completely different electrical grids. So you can zip around inside the borders of country A at lightning speed. But the second you want to transfer that momentum to country B, the high-speed track just abruptly ends at a brick wall.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
You literally have to stop the train, manually unload all the cargo, drag it across the border, and load it onto a completely incompatible train. The digital currency is incredibly fast inside its own silo, but it is completely halted by the lack of interoperability at the border.
Yeah, the incompatible train grids analogy hits the mechanical problem perfectly. It's just an architectural dead end. And this is exactly why the engineers behind this blueprint argue that these silos have to be aggressively dismantled.
Makes sense.
Because think about it, if an institution cannot easily move that sovereign asset across borders to utilize it in global trade, the asset completely loses its underlying utility.
But wait, hold on. Let me push back on that logic for a second. If a currency is sovereign, isn't that strict isolation kind of the entire point?
Well,
I mean, central banks demand absolute authority over their monetary supply, right? To manage inflation, monitor capital flight, protect their domestic economy. If a closed loop gives them that absolute control, why is this blueprint arguing they need to tear down the walls? Doesn't dismantling the silo fundamentally threaten their sovereignty?
That is the exact paradox they are trying to engineer their way out of. You are completely right that a central bank cannot compromise on control. That's a non-starter.
Right, they'd never agree to it.
Exactly. But in a heavily globalized economy, extreme isolation mathematically damages liquidity. If a sovereign digital asset is too rigid for international institutions to utilize efficiently, the market will simply bypass it for an asset that is efficient.
Oh, wow. So they're forced to adapt or be left behind.
Yes. So the blueprint's goal is to transform these rigid domestic assets into what they call a fluid, interoperable global mesh. They are proposing an infrastructure that theoretically preserves the central bank's ironclad control while simultaneously shattering the technological silo that chokes off the currency's liquidity.
And to pull off that specific magic trick, they're utilizing a very specific framework. The blueprint outlines an initiative to stress test the XRP Ledger's federated sidechain architecture.
Right. And this is where we move from the theoretical problem to the actual physical plumbing. The architecture relies on the concept of a sidechain, which is essentially a secondary blockchain that runs parallel to a primary network, in this instance, the main XRP ledger. It leverages the underlying security and consensus models of the main chain, but it operates independently. But the vital modifier here is the word federated.
Right, because an institution dealing with literal national wealth isn't going to just deploy its assets onto a completely permissionless public network where anyone with a laptop in their basement can become a validator.
Exactly. That would be a security nightmare. A federated sidechain is governed by a specific consortium, a federation of designated, heavily vetted institutions or entities.
I see.
They are the only ones authorized to validate transactions and maintain the state of that specific chain. It provides a walled garden of privacy and control, but one that is actually built on interoperable standards.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if I'm picturing the mechanics of this, it's like we have a massive public superhighway. That's the main permissionless blockchain. It's open to everyone, but maybe the traffic is unpredictable, and the rules of the road are just too loose for a government armored truck to feel secure.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it.
So the engineers construct this exclusive high-speed express lane that runs physically parallel to the main highway. You can only merge into this express lane if you meet the incredibly strict compliance standards set by a specific federation of highway authorities.
The express lane analogy works really well to conceptualize the privacy side of things, but let's take the mechanics a step further. It isn't just about controlling who gets to drive in the lane, it's about customizing the actual physics of the road to suit the vehicles.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, a federated sidechain can be mathematically tuned by its operators. They can adjust the block times, modify the transaction fee structures, or implement specific privacy protocols that a central bank might legally require, all without impacting the main public ledger. It's highly bespoke infrastructure.
But the blueprint specifically highlights that they are actively stress testing this federated architecture. What is the actual nature of that stress?
It's multifaceted.
Are we talking about trying to break the network with a sheer, overwhelming tsunami of institutional transaction volume? Or is the stress test focused on defending the network against geopolitical cyber threats? Because dealing with high throughput and dealing with state-sponsored hackers seem like two very different engineering challenges.
They are different challenges, yes, but in the realm of institutional finance, they are deeply intertwined. The stress test targets both vectors simultaneously because failure in either one is catastrophic.
Makes sense. So let's look at volume first.
Right. Consider the throughput. Institutional liquidity doesn't move in a nice, steady stream. It moves in massive, sudden spikes driven by algorithmic trading and big macroeconomic events. The federated sidechain has to process millions of complex, high-value state changes with zero latency.
Because if the network lags during a major market event...
millions of dollars are lost in slippage, instantly.
Wow. And on the security side?
The security stress is arguably the more brutal of the two. Look, if a retail crypto exchange gets hacked, it's a financial crime, it's bad. But if a federated sidechain that facilitates the movement of a G7 nation's sovereign currency gets compromised, you are dealing with a severe national security crisis.
Yeah, that's a completely different level of stakes.
Exactly. So the stress testing involves bombarding these sidechains with incredibly sophisticated attack vectors to ensure that the bespoke privacy controls and the Federation's consensus mechanism are impenetrable. They have to prove that this parallel express lane can handle the crushing weight of institutional traffic while remaining totally immune to bad actors.
Okay, so we have the parallel infrastructure. The federated sidechains provide the secure, customized tracks. But a track is useless without an engine to drive the cargo, right?
Very true.
If nation A has its currency on sidechain A, and nation B has its currency on sidechain B, how does the actual value traverse the gap between those two isolated networks?
And that's the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Well, the architecture gives us the exact mechanisms for this interoperability, right? Cross-chain bridges and automated market makers.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, these two technologies are the actual beating heart of the transition. The side chains are just the foundation. The bridges and the market makers are what create the fluidity.
So how do the bridges work?
Let's look mechanically at the cross-chain bridges first. They are the literal on-ramps and off-ramps connecting the different side chains.
But you can't just copy and paste a digital dollar from one blockchain to another. That would be double spending. You'd be artificially inflating the supply, just creating money out of thin air.
Yeah.
So how does the bridge physically move the value without duplicating it?
It uses a cryptographic lock and mint mechanism. The bridge is essentially a highly complex smart contract.
Okay.
When an institution wants to move value from sidechain A to sidechain B, they don't actually send the original asset. Instead, they send the asset into a secure programmatic vault on sidechain A. The smart contract locks that asset so it cannot be used.
I see.
And then, once the lock is cryptographically verified, the bridge simultaneously mints a synthetic, mathematically equivalent representation of that asset on sidechain B.
Oh, wow. So it's essentially a digital escrow. The original asset is frozen in place, serving as the collateral that completely backs the newly minted token on the destination chain.
Precisely. And when the institution wants to move the value back, the synthetic token on sidechain B is mathematically destroyed, or burned, as they say, and the smart contract unlocks the original asset on sidechain A.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, that is how the bridge spans the gap between the silos without ever violating the total circulating supply of the sovereign currency.
Okay, so the bridge gets the asset across the border. But the blueprint pairs those bridges with automated market makers, or AMMs, to generate what it calls seamless institutional liquidity. If the bridge is the physical connection between the two networks, the AMM is the actual engine of exchange.
Yes, exactly. Because in the legacy financial system, if an institution needs to swap massive amounts of one sovereign currency for another, they rely on traditional order books and human market makers.
Like large Tier 1 banks.
Right, large banks that act as intermediaries to match buyers with sellers. It takes time, it costs money in the form of widespreads, and it introduces a massive bottleneck. The blueprint relies on AMMs to mathematically eliminate that intermediary altogether.
So to visualize this, an AMM isn't a marketplace of buyers and sellers yelling at each other on a trading floor. It's more like two massive interconnected water tanks. Let's say one tank is filled with digital dollars and the other is filled with digital euros.
Okay, I like this.
If a massive institution comes in and pumps a huge volume of digital dollars into the first tank, the mathematical pressure of that contract forces the water level, which represents the price of the digital euros in the second tank, to instantly adjust. There is no human broker sitting there calculating the exchange rate or desperately looking for a counterparty. The algorithm simply forces the ratio of the two tanks to maintain perfect mathematical equilibrium.
The water tank analogy is a great way to understand the concept of a liquidity pool. The AM relies on those pools, vast reserves of assets locked into a smart contract, to facilitate the trade instantly against the algorithm rather than waiting for a human buyer to appear.
And that's the seamless liquidity.
Exactly. This is how you achieve it. The transaction executes instantly, 24 hours a day, driven purely by the constant product formula embedded in the code.
But wait, this introduces a massive glaring risk, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking about the critical liquidity of literal sovereign nations.
It's a huge shift, yes.
If you remove the Tier 1 banks and rely entirely on algorithmic water tanks to handle billions in national wealth, aren't you introducing a terrifying new vector for systemic failure? I mean, a human central banker might panic during a market crash, but a line of code with a hidden logical bug doesn't panic.
No, it doesn't.
It just flawlessly executes a catastrophic exploit at the speed of light. If someone hacks the lock and mint vault on the cross-chain bridge, those synthetic assets suddenly become worthless ghosts.
That is the exact nightmare scenario that necessitates the rigorous stress testing we discussed earlier. Shifting from human intermediaries to algorithmic execution is a monumental transfer of risk. You are trading the sluggishness and opacity of human bureaucracy for the unforgiving rigidity of code.
Right.
Yes, an AMM won't freeze up in a panic during a flash crash, but as you noted, a vulnerability in the smart contract governing the bridge could allow an attacker to drain the liquidity pools instantly.
So how does the architecture justify that immense risk?
By heavily restricting the environment, this is why they are not proposing this on a public permissionless blockchain. By utilizing federated sidechains, they can severely limit who has access to the underlying infrastructure.
Ah, so the walls do serve a purpose.
Definitely. Furthermore, the code governing these specific AMMs and bridges is subjected to levels of formal mathematical verification that go far, far beyond standard software audits. They are basically betting that a mathematically verifiable closed-loop algorithmic system is ultimately more resilient and vastly more efficient than the fragmented, human-driven correspondent banking network we rely on today.
Which brings us to the ultimate endgame of this entire blueprint. The architecture claims that by combining these federated sidechains with automated market makers, they can forge a network that maintains strict regulatory compliance without sacrificing decentralized speed.
This raises an important question, and it really gets to the crux of why this architecture is so revolutionary. Look at the historical relationship between compliance and speed.
They usually hate each other.
Exactly. Strict regulatory compliance involves incredibly dense friction, anti-money laundering checks, know your customer verifications, international sanction list scrubbing, capital velocity limits. Every single time money moves, it hits a regulatory wall.
And on the flip side, decentralized speed implies instant, frictionless, peer-to-peer settlement.
Right. Historically, these two forces are entirely mutually exclusive. If you want speed, you have to bypass compliance. If you want compliance, you have to sacrifice speed.
So what does this all mean for the actual transaction? How do you engineer a system that delivers both? Because to me, it sounds like trying to drive a Formula One race car at 200 miles an hour through a heavily monitored school zone.
That's a great visual.
You have the engine capable of decentralized speed, but you have a legal obligation to stop at every single crosswalk, yield to every crossing guard, and obey this incredibly strict regulatory speed limit. It feels like an unsolvable contradiction.
It is unsolvable if you rely on the legacy model of compliance, which is entirely reactive.
Reactive meaning after the fact.
Right. In the current banking system, you initiate a transfer, say via the SWIFT network. That message is sent. And then a series of human compliance officers or batch processing software systems at the correspondent banks review the transaction after it has been initiated to ensure it doesn't violate any rules.
Oh, and if it flags a warning, the money is frozen while humans investigate.
Yes. And that is exactly why international wires take days. The architecture we are dissecting proposes a massive paradigm shift, moving from reactive human compliance to proactive cryptographic enforcement.
Meaning the rules aren't checked by some human sitting at a desk after the fact.
Exactly. To create that fluid, interoperable mesh, the regulatory compliance has to be baked directly into the smart contracts that govern the assets and the cross-chain bridges.
But if I'm an institution trying to send a sovereign digital asset from a federated sidechain in Europe across a bridge through an AMM to a sidechain in Asia, whose rulebook are we following? How does the network know which laws to apply without stopping the transaction to ask a human authority?
Because the laws are written into the metadata of the digital asset itself and into the execution environment of the bridge. When an institution initiates that cross-border transfer, the smart contract instantaneously queries a decentralized oracle or a verified cryptographic list of current sanctions and capital controls.
In real time.
In a fraction of a millisecond. It evaluates all the regulatory conditions instantly. If the mathematical conditions of the compliance check are not perfectly satisfied, the smart contract simply refuses to execute the lock-and-mint process.
To go back to the Formula One analogy, it's not that you're asking the driver to hit the brakes in the school zone. The engineers have literally programmed the engine of the car so that it physically cannot ignite if it detects a red light or a restricted zone ahead.
Exactly.
The compliance isn't a barrier on the road. It is a limitation hard-coded into the physics of the vehicle itself.
That is precisely how they achieve the paradox. By shifting from human enforcement to cryptographic enforcement, the transaction can settle at the speed of light because the very act of the transaction executing is mathematical proof that it was compliant. It physically cannot execute otherwise.
Man, it is a total reimagining of how monetary control is exercised globally.
It really is, and this is how the architects of the system believe they can solve the silo problem. They aren't trying to strip central banks of their power. They are giving them a way to mathematically guarantee their domestic laws are followed, even as their sovereign currency moves fluidly across international interoperable networks.
All right, let's pull all these threads together for you and recap the architecture we've explored in this deep dive. We started with the foundational roadblock, right? Modern sovereign digital currencies are inherently trapped in rigid, incompatible technological silos that choke off their global liquidity.
Right, the train track problem.
Exactly. Then we examined how the architects planned to dismantle those walls using federated sidechains, building heavily stress-tested, bespoke parallel networks for institutional capital. We broke down the mechanics of the engine, exploring how cryptographic lock-and-mint bridges and algorithmic automated market makers replaced the slow, human-driven correspondent banking system.
And finally, we unpacked the ultimate engineering feat, embedding strict regulatory compliance directly into the code of the assets, allowing for proactive cryptographic enforcement that settles at blinding decentralized speed.
Right. It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It is, but it's a blueprint for a fundamentally different financial reality. We are moving away from a system of static, isolated pools of national wealth and trying to engineer a dynamic, fully interconnected global nervous system of capital.
And as we wrap up our analysis today, I want to leave you with a lingering thought, just something to consider that builds on the mechanics we just dissected. This blueprint proves that, technologically speaking, the silos can be dismantled. The lock-and-mint bridges work. The AM algorithms can handle the liquidity. The compliance can be cryptographically enforced. But if this engineering vision actually becomes the global standard, if sovereign national currencies are transformed into fluid, interoperable assets that are constantly, instantly traded by emotionless algorithms across a borderless mesh of federated sidechains, does the very concept of a distinct, independent national economy eventually cease to exist?
Wow.
Right? If the friction of moving value is mathematically eliminated, do economic borders even matter anymore?
It is a profound consequence to consider. When the underlying architecture makes the borders completely invisible to the capital itself, the definition of sovereignty itself will inevitably have to adapt to the new physics of the network.
Absolutely. Well, we want to thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. We always appreciate you taking the time to critically examine the architectural shifts happening just beneath the surface of our world. Because, the next time you hear about a central bank upgrading its digital infrastructure, you will know that the real revolution isn't the digital currency itself. It's the invisible, algorithmic bridges silently connecting it to the rest of the globe.